which leads to my first observation, which is that of an overgeneralization. An overgeneralization. My opponents are trying to make a blanket solution to a very specific problem. We have to recognize that not all trolling, they even admitted this, not all trolling inherently leads to things such as defamation. However, the problem is that my opponents are not advocating for specifically targeting the trolls that lead to defamation. They are instead targeting all trolling in general. And we'll be seeing throughout the speech that is far too much of a blanket statement to be voted for in today's round. So first, let's look at the argumentation they brought up in their last speech. Now first, they talked about this idea of how we should not be allowed to speak harm. Now in response to this, and this was where they talked about the unfortunate case of the young man who killed himself by stepping in front of a train. Now in response to this is that freedom of speech is reasonably limited. Freedom of speech is reasonably limited. There is definitely a point at which freedom of speech becomes far too dangerous and far too toxic. However, we have to recognize that within the status quo, within the opposition world, those are already protected against. We have slander and libel, limits to your freedom of speech. There is a threshold that you pass with your freedom of speech that becomes too far. There is a bridge too far, and that was the bridge too far. However, voting for the affirmative would not change anything. Yes?
How does the opposition team propose to improve the status quo?
The status quo does not need to be improved, and I'll be talking about that throughout. And what we'll be seeing is that the actions have already been taken, and even your very plan has already been taken. However, if we take your plan, it will become the next bridge too far. Now moving on to the argumentation of how trolling leads to harm, and they talked about the 20% number here. I would like to group this with their subpoint A under their advantage 1 of trolling equals cyberbullying, and then the subpoint B, which is that of equivalent to defamation. Now I have two responses to all of these. My first response is that of a turn, already punished. Turn, already punished. My opponents are trying to make this argumentation that defamation is not already punished within the status quo, but it is. We already have slander and libel. If we look at trolling, it specifically would fall under libel. It already falls under libel, as does cyberbullying. This idea that if you take an action that damages someone else's reputation, you already get prosecuted. Your last question.
Is social media trolling currently considered as a subset of defamation legally?
No. However, libel is considered as something that leads to defamation, which is already prosecuted. If you look at the definition of libel, it's a written statement that degrades someone else's reputation, which is what these toxic instances of trolling and cyberbullying you're talking about would fall under. So it is already being prosecuted. Something we have to recognize here is that my opponents haven't brought up any specific evidence that says trolling is not already being prosecuted. And what we see is that defamation and libel are already illegal under the status quo, and voting for the government team would not change that. All it would do would make all trolling, all potentially offensive statements illegal, which damages the very American idea of freedom of speech. My second response to this is that of not all trolling. Not all trolling. We have to recognize that, again, my opponents even said this in their own case. They said that trolling can lead to defamation. Now, what we recognize there is that if can versus does. Trolling does not inherently lead to defamation. If you look at the definition of trolling, quote, making a deliberately offensive or provocative online post with the aim of upsetting someone. What we see there is that certainly that has the potential to lead to defamation. However, it does not inherently lead to defamation, which is why we should not be outlawing and making the overgeneralization of outlawing all trolling, because again, that's an overgeneralization. And if you look at what they already said, they actually gave us an example of trolling where they said, I hate you and everything in your mind. Now, this is definitely a deliberately offensive or provocative statement. However, what we have to recognize there is that that is not inherently defamatory. It's definitely offensive and provocative. However, it does not necessarily damage someone else's reputation. We have to prove that. And what we see there is that, again, the idea of can versus does. And unless my opponent can definitively prove to you that every possible instance of trolling will always lead to defamation, you should not be voting government at the end of today's debate round. Now moving on to their other subpoints under their advantage 1. Under their subpoint C of team suicide, you can tag my response to that of actions already taken. Actions already taken. Now, teen suicide is something horrible that should definitely be prevented against. However, by voting government, you're not going to be changing anything in today's world. You're just going to be adding on a violation of freedom of speech because, again, when trolling crosses that threshold, crosses into the line of libel and slander, it does get prosecuted as defamation. And even if you look at their own case, they're applying the same punishments to defamation to trolling, but that's already going on in today's society. My partner kind of talked on this a little bit. The idea that from Susan Branner, which is the idea that cyberbullying should not be considered distinct from bullying because it falls under the exact same consequences. And that's what we see with trolling. We shouldn't consider it as some distinct thing that we need to handle differently, because it frankly doesn't need to be handled differently. It falls under the exact same laws and the exact same violations and punishments of regular bullying in today's world. So there's no reason to vote with the government team because the harms are already being solved for. Now, moving on to their subpoint D, which is that if the plan solves the problem, my response is that if the plan is already implemented, the plan is already implemented. Again, their plan is inherent, and they didn't really respond to this too much, which is that defamation is already considered illegal, and trolling already has the potential to cross that threshold into defamation, which means that when it does, it will logically be prosecuted. So what we see here is that if we kind of take a step back and kind of examine this round on a very simplified basis, we see the government plan is not warranted in today's debate round because its protections are already implemented in today's society. By saying that trolling must be outlawed because it always leads to defamation is an overgeneralization. Freedom of speech is something that is very important. It's a double-edged sword, however. There is an aspect of freedom of speech that will be offensive, that will be provocative. But that does not mean that we can outlaw all freedom of speech. If we allowed the government the ability to just decide what offensive meant and what provocative meant, and allow them to outlaw anything based on those grounds, then where would the government stop? My partner talked about this in an impact of the slippery slope. We have to recognize that the slippery slope is very real. Government should not be taking more actions to stop freedom of speech when they've already implemented plenty of restrictions to protect against defamation, against slander, and against libel. So why should you be voting in favor of the opposition in the end of today's debate round? The answer is simply because the First Amendment must be protected, and trolling is too far of a generalized statement to say that it always leads to defamation. Thank you.